Okay, it says it's recording, John, so we'll see how we go on there. Sorry about that. Okay, and then obviously, in theory, the response in some way perhaps counteracts the deviation from the point, brings you back within your normal range. So if you see amoeba, I'm at water temperature I can handle. If it's an organisation, we are now heading in the right direction, or potentially even I'm driving in the car, I'm back within the lane I was supposed to be, not drifting over to the right-hand one or the left-hand one where I didn't want to be. So this is quite a nice model to think about the way measurement works. And I'm going to kind of jump straight into something which you're familiar, which is really just dealing with the, sensor, control center, effector part of it, which is sort of talking about listening to the voice of the process. And this is sort of very familiar to anyone who's read anything about Deming or Schuhart or anyone who's resulting from that, where, sort of organizations being a form of system, they receive inputs and produce outputs, they produce the data about all sorts of things which normally get reported. So the key job of management here is prediction, seeing what's happening, the patterns of what's going on within the organization. But in order for people to actually sort of take numbers in a state and then come to some conclusions, the numbers needs to have some sense applied to them. But that's quite a difficult thing in many organizations. So rarely are those numbers analyzed in a way that is unambiguous or the basis for a good rational decision. So, if you look at even the COVID-19 situation, or organizations reacting to, a good marketing budget or a bad sales quarter, all sorts of things happen. So bad habits are, and we can spot these in the press, comparing one number to another, this week to last week, yesterday to today, this week with last year. So comparisons can be confusing and don't necessarily account for the underlying pattern. It's important to understand the pattern. Now, actually, it may be that an uptick or a downtick is relevant, but without understanding the pattern, you don't really know that. And also then comparing percentages is another sort of characteristic of this. So lots of data can get presented, and is commonly presented in the sort of the table that you see on the bottom right of the screen. So it's a bunch of months. Interestingly, you asked the question, well, there's a bit of variance from this month, the same month last year. Notice there's a comparison to a last year. Is the 3 months out of alignment with the previous 3? Possibly, possibly not. Unless you actually take a look at the data and the pattern, you're not necessarily going to get it. Now, there is a way which actually allows you to make sense of some of this, to graph the numbers. So I'm not going to use statistical process control chart as a piece of terminology because it implies that SPC, sometimes people think that SPC means it's under control or it gives control. Well, it doesn't. It just tells you what the behavior is. It's the response to it that allows you to determine whether you've got control and how you deal with it. So why this way? Well, comparisons are very limited. When the moment you start charting the result, you actually then you can start looking for the types of variation that exist in real world data, right? The common cause stuff, which is, it's just a small variation on the previous day. Don't worry about it. It's within normal variation. Or special cause implies there's some factor. It's not normal, normally external, but might be internal as well. And when attempting to change any process, you really should attempt to try and resolve special cause variations first. I think the biggest disease I find with people and special cause variation is people just don't spot them. They don't take action. They can, as a bit of a hoo-ha about the report and someone gets kind of kicked. But actually, who really figures out what happened? Very rarely does that take place in many corporate organizations. So bar and pie charts don't really help you see this very well, but the process behavior chart does that, and you can put in process limits. So that's telling you the expected upper and lower bounds for the values. And it really just tells you the process is behaving or whether it's predictable or unpredictable. So if you take a look at what that looks like, you start sort of saying, well, I can see in the chart, for example, that this particular process is pretty much, variation within common cause. You can see there's sort of that perhaps there's a bit of a pattern there. That might be if you spotted that those things might be part of a seasonal pattern or a monthly pattern or a weekly pattern, but you'd have to start looking for the patterns, and that's the important thing. Compare your results to the real world, try and figure out what's actually happening. So an interesting set of thoughts that you can ask for your own organization or your own environment is, how do reports work? Are they just data? Do people use point comparison? Do the reports distinguish between normal behavior and exceptional events? Is the data of quality sufficient to assess aspects of behavior? So the consequences of, and then what are the consequences of not understanding the data properly? And then finally, to what extent is that data driving continual improvement and innovation where that's appropriate for you to do? Now, having sort of taken a quick gamble through the world of listening to the voice of the process, I want to sort of focus on the last word for a second, because of course it's really easy for us to sort of say, well, we measure what we can measure, but actually quite often organizations measure what they can rather than measure what they should be measuring about a process or what's going on in their organization. And so the next bit of this presentation is really starting to explore the aspect of, well, how do I actually take a process and design my measurement for it? Because that's really key to getting good measurement. Very easy to measure, not necessarily easy to measure the right things. So this is a way of you exploring the measurement system that you've got. And it's centered on the process in the middle. It's useful when you're explaining something. John, hand up.
I was wondering if it might be a good time to grab a couple of questions from the audience.
Yeah, that's okay. All right, let me just retrench to the previous slide and let's just ask questions before I move on to design. Any quick questions? Maybe just give it 5 minutes and I'll move on. Any burning ones? You'll need to come off mute if you are on mute. Or is there anything on the chat that's worth exploring, John?
Yeah, there's a question here from Paresh.
Hi, Tony. Really enjoying your presentation. I do a lot of work within the settings of the blue light services, and I've written extensively about the performance metrics in the ambulance service. So we all know the 8-minute target, the key target for the ambulance service to reach to a patient within that time. And what is ironical about the target is that this is the target which simply measures the time. It doesn't measure any kind of clinical intervention or clinical outcome. So you can be rude to a patient, or you can do anything to the patient, or even the patient die. Even if the patient dies, it doesn't matter, as long as you're able to measure that part of the journey. That journey is a success, which is really, really bizarre. So quite interesting what you're saying.
Yeah, I think Paresh, that and perhaps the next couple of slides will help to uncover that a little bit, because your point about Kaplan and Norton is really interesting. It's absolutely right. What gets measured, what gets done, and even though the balanced scorecard that they eventually then developed was supposed to help you with measurement design, I don't think it's very well used. It's used by lots of organizations, but not used to their original spirit. So I find that, when I look at balanced scorecard, I find, a mountain of measures about finances and efficiency, but very little about learning and growth.
Sure.
And I think that's a particularly, and even sometimes a customer quadrant is neglected. So I think the balanced scorecard is quite a nice mechanism. Even better, if you've come across it, is Andy Neely's mechanism called the performance prism, which is even better than the balanced scorecard because it's better at dealing with the issues around strategy and suppliers and the alignment of your value chain. Okay. And John's sort of asked a question on the chat, which is scorecard measures being often what's to hand more than the crunch points. And I think that's, again, for me, John, that's absolutely critical to thinking about how do you design your measurement system? So I think balanced scorecard, if used well, or performance prism are great ways of exploring the measurement system from a strategic perspective. Once you get into process world, then I think the next couple of slides may uncover some ways of exploring measures for a particular process that you're interested in your organization, or perhaps your primary process or number of primary processes that you need to focus on. Okay, if I move on. Okay, right. So this is a model. So like all models, it's wrong, but it might be useful. So this is just a way of designing measurement for a process. So it's quite useful at the start of this, if you sort of say, well, what is the process I'm going to focus on? So what's in the green blob? And then what happens, who does it, what are the key tasks that exist within it? And in particular, what's the start point and end point of the process that you're attempting to think about the measures for? Now, this sort of uses a little bit of the thinking behind IDF 0 for anyone who's ever modeled processes in IDF 0, or Taskoi if you've used Specchio's model for transformation. But it kind of starts with the idea that kind of obviously the fundamentals which people have been used to dealing with is, well, I get inputs which are demand, and I get possibly some rework demand, assuming that if the process didn't deal with everything perfectly the first time and couldn't recover it, I probably got things that got sent back somewhere else, especially if you're in a service organization with lots of information. And hopefully you've got outputs, which are the things that you want to see from the process. Then on top, you've got kind of controls, which could be things that allow me to monitor how well the process is functioning inside itself, i.e. within the bounds. I probably have some start timing measurement. I might have some end timing measurement. And obviously, if I'm doing things well, I'm converting inputs into outputs. So I should have not only the inputs, the demand into the process, but also the output, what I actually created. What I've also suggested that people should think about in their process measurement modeling, and I've used this on lots of processes with people, but it's quite nice as a way of describing and discussing what you've actually got, is it's useful to think about, well, what fell out? You know, what was the kind of pile of sand that fell at the bottom of the process? Said, I didn't want this to happen because it wasn't an output I was planning for. So what is it? You know, what are the failure outputs? You know, so for example, in Parish's example, did you have a situation where the ambulance simply just didn't get there, or there was some other intervention, or some other problem occurred, or you know, perhaps failure output was actually it was a hoax call. That's something you don't want. It's not a desirable outcome or output of the process. And then obviously, if you've got any failure output at all, there is something that you're doing probably with it, which either means I'm either reworking it. So a good example of that may be, for example, I have a very complicated ordering process with lots of characteristics. Sometimes I can recover the process if it goes wrong. I haven't got the information I need by simply contacting a customer and going, that telephone number you gave me for your contact in Kuala Lumpur wasn't valid. Can you give me a valid number, please? Or you might have to go back and say, well, actually, no, the products that we had on the order form isn't a product that can be sold adequately at a particular speed or service functionality in a particular country. Sorry, have to go back to sales and re-discuss that with the customer because there's a problem. So you can distinguish between things you can sort of recover in process and things where you might actually have to go back to a previous stage and go, no, that didn't work. And ideally, what happens in the red bit of the process is minimal. But if you've got it, you probably should understand what's going on. And then the rest of the model is really all about asking two questions about each stage or each criteria. The measures in green are the ones that we need and can measure. And the measures in red are the ones that we need but cannot currently measure. And when you do this for a process, it's surprising how much people go, actually, there's quite a lot that's in red. And you start asking questions about, well, why is that in red? Well, we couldn't get the IT developers to build it. We couldn't define a way of capturing that data on our systems. There's all sorts of reasons why people struggle and put things in the red piece. This is sort of merely a talking framework. Like I said, it's a model for you thinking about how measurement would work. And where it really comes to life is when I look at what it looks like in reality. So here's a real one that happens in a process which I'm not going to tell you that much about, but the process was called validate customer order, and it kind of falls back to the example I gave you before, which is it's possible for customers to provide really, really complex orders with lots of criteria, and sometimes bits of those orders don't go wrong. So you have an order validation, they validate the order specialist, they put the orders on the systems, they do an order check, and the customer contact validation happens within that process, i.e. this is the thing about the telephone number in Kuala Lumpur as an example. So in theory, the output is I've got a new order, or potentially I've got some DOAs, and the team that actually gave me this information said, well, I can measure new orders and I can measure dead on arrivals. I haven't got a clue about how many in-flight changes I get on an order from the customer. So this means that the order is in progress, but the customer's given me a change. I previously wanted, I don't know, a broadband service, and now I want a high-speed video service. And that's an in-flight change, but they don't measure them. Neither do they measure rework unclean coming back to them. Of course, they measured completed stages. I have done a bit of the order, but they didn't know how many failed orders had a knock-on effect on this validation stage, and they didn't know how many orders didn't need the information at the far end validated. Similarly, when I looked at the timing, they could measure the stage duration, they could measure activity task time as a synthetic, but they didn't really have any idea between the dwell times. So they could measure sort of rough idea what the time was, but they didn't know how much time that order was active, being worked on by someone, and how much time it was just sitting in a queue on an IT system waiting for someone to pick it up. So that was a real gap for them. Similarly, when I look at failure output, they could measure failures and exceptions, but they didn't really know how many occurred at the task level. They could measure the overall sort of piece, but not individual sub-aspects. And they could measure defect action and resolve time, but again, they had no idea of how much time was being spent in dealing with in-flight changes. Bit of a better handle on rework. They knew how many unclean orders and rejection cases they had, and they also knew how many they could fix in stage, but they didn't really have an idea of other order resolutions in stage, i.e. sort of what other things happened with other departments to resolve things. And then in the top piece, just the controls is a really interesting part of it. This particular department had a pretty good handle on controlling their stage, how much work in progress, how many orders in delay, how many were in delay days, and what was the what were the numbers of backlogs. So they kind of had that bit done, but as you can see, there were lots of areas this particular team went, actually we need to rethink some of our aspects of timing and being able to measure particularly in-flight changes from customer. So this is really, as I said, it's a discussion framework. It allows a team to think about what they might want to measure. Kevin's just asked a good question on the chat, which is, what about the measures you can make but which don't help? That's a really damn good question, Kevin. Quite often it's interesting to actually go back and so ask that question, well, who is the measurement for? In a way, I'm going to come to that in the next bit of it, but maybe it's that it doesn't help because it's not serving the right people. And so sometimes managers want measures that are actually of zero use to the people on the ground floor. And one of the reasons that they don't help is that they are of zero use is the managers haven't actually bothered to go and see what happens in the real operation. And so, it's a really interesting question about what's measured but doesn't help. And again, you can look at the COVID-19 situation. I mean, the only thing I can say is in a good organization, managers come to the front and they go, what do you need to actually make sense of this and how to do that? And Ron's had a comment in the chat about they may not be useful now, but may prove to be in the future. So I would argue, Ron, that actually if a measure is useful, it's useful. So sometimes you want to have an eye on measurement on the things that you use day to day, but you also want to have an eye on the measurement that help you see the larger, bigger pattern. And I'm going to come to that later in the presentation, as I'll talk a little bit more about the difference between actuality, capability, and potentiality, because a lot of the usefulness in the future has to do with potentiality, what's possible of performance. So this whole purpose bit is really interesting, isn't it? What is the purpose is a great question of measurement. It has potentially 3 purposes, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Ketan, do you want to come off mute?
Yeah, I can do. I'm not sure whether you picked this up, but my point was around latent demand. So demand that hasn't entered the process because it's latent, right? And it's almost been pushed away. So two good examples. One is if I ring my broadband provider and it says a 10-minute wait, I just put the phone down, right, and don't bother. Okay, so that demand is never measured directly unless they measure it. And the other one, I mean, a good example. The other example is COVID, right? Because the government was showing how much capacity they had in terms of being able to do tests if you had the virus. But the latent demand was never shown. It was never shown that actually the demand is X 100,000 that we would like, is a demand that's pending, right? So that number was never shared. Yeah,
that's a good thought. Just to flick back to your point about latent demand, I would argue that that's still demand. So perhaps if you have latent demand, where someone's coming into an interactive voice response system, but then dropping out going, I can't be bothered to wait, that's still demand. It's actually failed at the very first stage because there's a process which is about steering and guiding the person with the demand to the right place with the right sort of contact. If that has fallen out because the person gave up, because either the interactive voice response was really crummy or they didn't want the 10-minute wait, that's failure output because it meant that the customer's demand has not been served. So you haven't got the desired output because you never got there because they gave up in the wait. So in that situation, latent demand, I think we still treat Ketan as demand because it is there, whether or not the process successfully managed to process it.
Okay, thank you.
There's a question a little bit about measurement being linked to accountability or governance as well as in reality. Again, I'm going to come to that a little bit later, Parish, because I want to talk about Stafford Beer's stuff right towards the end. And then on the question about Martin saying who's receiving the output, what are the expectations? Well, that's key, isn't it? Because if you've designed the process well, you've actually thought about the outputs meeting the expectations of either the next stage, or of course you can use this model at the meta level for the whole process, or you can use it for an individual subcomponent. If it's at the meta level and it's the customer, then it's the value receiver of the whole process. If it's at an individual stage, then the argument is, well, the output's going as an input to someone else, and they have an expectation that it meets certain standards. So I would talk about that. Russ, good question. How do we prevent the indicators becoming targets? Educate management better is probably my suggested response to it, because actually that's one of the problems. I think we educate our leaders very poorly about measurement and the consequences of dysfunctional behavior around measurement. So they put targets on things. I will talk about that a little bit at the end, but I'm going to skip on, given with bearing in mind time. I just want to, conscious this is a very busy slide with very small writing in it, but the important thing is that measurement itself is in fact a process. So you can argue that it has lots of different, it has strategic, operational, development bits in it. It has strategic bits are about, reviewing measurement frameworks, looking at what the requirements are, matching the requirements, making sure the requirements are mapped to processes, defining measures and counting rules for your measures, applying targets and benchmarks if you need to. You don't always have to, of course. Training your process and measures users, identifying patterns, trends, and exceptions, and then identifying different priorities, whether that's operational or strategic. There's a certain realpolitik here, because you'll see the word targets exist. And when I first put this process together, people said, well, I need to be able to have things where I have targets. And again, managers do have targets. So what I did do in the section about how to look about targets and how to analyze results to targets was try and give people sensible, practical, and I suppose ethically sensible ways of approaching the targeting question, including when or when not to even apply targets to the measures. So it's quite a busy process. The important thing about this particular little bit of cycle or process can be happening to any measure for any process or any sub-process at one time. Each flow through this is potentially an instance, a question for either a process or a measurement set or even an individual measure. So it is a sort of cycle, it's just that when you get to the end, you potentially start again. John and I were talking about this yesterday. It's like painting the Forth Road Bridge, this. But the only trouble is there's about 400 of them, or there might be 4,000 of them, depending on the complexity of your organization. So imagine you're doing this all the time for your measures. Each an individual measure or set of measurement could be subject to any part of this process. You could be doing this. So the whole point about having the idea of measurement as a process is as a way of people thinking about that there are bits of the measurement behavior that relates to others and that people do, and that you need to manage and give people guidance to. And that's not only developers and operational managers, but also senior managers, leaders, up to the chief executive about how they actually manage their measures. So within that measure, you'll notice there's a section called Define Measures and Counting Rules. This is quite often where measures just go completely AWOL and things go entirely wrong. COVID-19 is a lovely example of perhaps how not to measure consistently across the different pieces. There are 2 pages of this, and you can, I'm not going to go through all of this because there's quite a lot of it, but the important point is there are several criteria by which you can say what is a measure. i.e. it should be uniquely identifiable, people should understand, what's it called, what's the definition, what is the point of having the measure, the purpose, which processes does it relate to, how might you structure and segment the measure, i.e. is it segmented by country, geography, product, customer, all sorts of ways of tiering and segmenting measures, useful to have it defined. What's the formula for its calculation? What's the reporting unit? How often do you report it? All of these things needs to be thought about and specified for people to have common and good understanding of the measure. Now, when I get even to the second lot of this, then it gets more technical. So actually, in most measures, you probably have potentially a numerator and denominator. You may have both. And in that, I would expect people to say what data is included or excluded from both the numerator and denominator, what units they're expressed in, what data fields are used. What's the bounds of a measure? I've still seen results in operational measures where someone hit 102% of something. How's that possible? Why did the measure not go, 102% of something that is a whole is not possible? Why can it count that? Or I've seen measures where people have said, actually the average delivery time for this particular process stage was -7 days. That's not possible either, is it? So again, bounds should define, hold on, it is an alert. I'm just going to, put my hand up and go, problem here. Targets, if absolutely necessary and well aligned to a strategic objective. Owner, who owns it? Reporter, who reports it? The source and reporting is all about the data points and where it comes from. There should also be some specification of how the reports on a particular measure are formatted and presented. And then question 18 is an absolutely crunch question. Who acts on the data and what do they do with it? Because if you can't answer that question, don't bother developing and reporting the measure. Meeting and we discuss the results and we look at the trends and we look at the patterns, blah, 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 and we do this. If they can't say that, why are they even bothering to ask you for it? Then any related measures, comments, status is useful because sometimes measures could have multiple versions live at any one point, and then obviously version numbering just helps you control it. So if you want, and I've seen this done before, you can actually have a database of the measures in your organization that allow you to manage stuff. Parish, ethics. Did you want to talk about ethics very quickly before we moved on to the next stage?
Yeah, because this is again something which I did a couple of years back, looking into the whole process of the target metrics in the ambulance service. And again, I took a slightly academic framework in arguing that one of the reasons we find why some of those targets and some of the points you've just put across in the last 2 slides resonate in many ways what I have found as well. The idea is who is the actual owner of the target, what is the real audience. And so to take an example, like if you would imagine that the patient interface or the patient voice in the whole regime of target setting would be quite important for the ambulance service. I'm not sure whether everybody will be surprised that that is the least point of consideration, because in a funny way, because 80% of the people who are required to be transported in an ambulance service are in trauma. They are experiencing some kind of trauma and they are in no position to give their viewpoint or anything. So the whole ethics of target setting within this context is really, really interesting. And again, I'm quite happy to share my paper on that as well, because I think, and I've taken an argument that we need to look at this in a more kind of ethical way about what exactly some of the things you are just presenting in the last 2 slides means and who benefits. So I'm conscious of time. So and there's a famous quote I normally use in my work, that if you get to a patient within 8 minutes and if the patient dies, that is still a success because you hit the target. But if you take 8 minutes and 10 seconds, or if you do any intervention, and if the patient survives, you fail your target because you've taken more time.
It's insane, isn't it? Very, very, very happy if you're willing to share the paper, Parish. That sounds absolutely fantastic. Just get back in touch with John and myself at the end of the call, and we can see what we can do about that. But I think you're absolutely right. And Kevin says, would the customer pay you for the target? Well, yeah, actually, the customer typically pays you for the output. Whether they perceive that the output and the target are in some way connected is also part of the interesting question. Because in Parish's example, the customer, perhaps a relative whose father or mother was treated and the intervention actually saved their lives, but it took 8 minutes, 10 seconds, actually really doesn't care about the 10 seconds, do they? They care about the fact that the intervention was successful with the patient. One of the things I just wanted to point out, and this is typically a bit of a dysfunction, is sometimes the person who owns the measure is not the same person who owns the target. And the moment you come up against that, you get into some interesting problems, i.e. the chief executive owns the target, the actual operational manager owns the measure, but they get told to apply the target whether or not it is sensible. And the ambulance service or telecoms or healthcare or is absolutely relevant to that point. The moment you get a dysfunction between targeting and ownership, you actually end up with some serious problems quite often. Right, I'm going to just move on to the last couple of bits of this. And I want to introduce you to an idea which I'm hoping might be useful. Some of this will, not all of this will be useful, but I think this is a really good way that the management thinker, Stafford Beer, who developed the viable systems model, describes this idea of a triple vector to characterize activity and operations, what he calls system one, the primary activities of the organization, i.e. the heart of the the process system in Deming's world. And the vectors that he talks about and that you need to distinguish between are these three. Actuality. What are we managing to do now with existing resources under existing constraints? So what is the actual behavior that you're observing within the process that you're looking at, or within the organization you're looking at? And he says that's different from capability, which is what we could be doing still right now with existing resources if we really worked at it. And not by really working at it, he's not saying, you know, we will work miracles, but he's saying, you know, if we manage to eliminate the silly sort of special causes and do the simple improvements, what could we do right now with the current people and the existing systems and infrastructure that we have if we just fix the obvious things? And it's really interesting that I sat in front of a production manager a few years ago and said, well, actually, your actuality is pretty good. You're kind of running at about 92%, you know, sort of quality output, which seems okay for the product you've got. You could achieve as good as, you know, 99%. And he went, oh, that's fantastic. But I said, but you could also achieve as poorly as 81. And he went, oh, I can't go down to 81. I said, but that's the capability of the process you've got, considering the variation that's going on. And so he was worried about that lower capability range because he wasn't really sort of thinking about the variation. What is interesting though, if you then apply this idea of thinking about the potentiality, so this is where some of the kind of strategy and ethics gets into it. What could we really do by developing the resources we've got and removing constraints, although operating within the bounds of what's known to be feasible? So for example, potentiality for, say, an ambulance getting to a patient might be, well, actually, it's a combination of then of time and of intervention quality. But actually, you wouldn't expect someone to say, oh, the ambulance can get to patients within 15 seconds. Because we know that's not feasible unless someone finds a way of teleporting paramedics, in which case it will suddenly become feasible and you'd start changing your exploration of potentiality. But it's a really interesting set of questions to ask. What is the difference between those three? So the role of people in developing the operational system, this is Beer's words, but resonates so wonderfully in Deming, is to realize as much potential as possible. And how can you do this? You can do continual improvement, you can re-engineer, and you can transform things. Now, what Beer goes on to say is then you can actually explore three different ways of thinking about your performance and ratios. Not everybody does this. I mean, it is a kind of little bit of tricky mathematics. It's probably used in Chile in the cybernetics experiment, but you can use a ratio of productivity based on actuality and capability to say, well, what's my notional productivity? What's the latency I have between capability and potentiality? That's from where I might get to and where I might really get to. And then performance then becomes a function of the latency and the productivity. Now, so you can actually aggregate all your results about a particular area and then start saying, well, what is notionally performance? It's a bit tricky for people to understand. But I think it's really useful. Ross has asked a good question about how do you kind of measure capability if not by actuality? Well, in a way, capability and actuality are absolutely connected. So capability is just exploring a number of things. It's exploring the variation in the actuality. But it also says, and this is the important point, what could we be doing with existing resources under existing constraints if we really worked at it? And by really working at it, say, what can we actually do to improve and eliminate the special causes and make the obvious continual improvements?
So it could be pushing, it's elastic, it's pushing where you are experimentally.
Yeah, you could argue that probably the biggest way of improving your capability is actually just dealing with the obvious no-brainer continual improvements, the incremental stuff, which you know you can do with the current people under the existing constraints. The argument would be that I would suggest that you only really move towards the potentiality question when you're saying, how can I fundamentally change this? And that might be different IT, different way of organising, different way of providing autonomy into the organisation.
It's to do with the system boundary, isn't it? It's how much can the system improve on its own and how much is outside of it, and that's the potential.
That's another good way of looking at it.
Okay, I like it. Thank you, Tony.
And I think, sort of when actuality then deviates from what your expectations of capability are, then you should be sending an alert to the management going, hello, you should be looking at something, correct an error, correct improvement, adopt a good technique. And routine response functions needs to be given order to actually reflect good practice and monitor for improvement. So in Parash's example, I would argue that actually it's just as important for people to look at the outcome of an intervention that maybe occurs within 8 minutes 10 seconds, rather than just go, did it be was it absolutely just within this arbitrary targeted figure? What was the outcome is a really interesting, and you go back to that question right at the beginning about the process, about what's the desired output? What do we really want to happen here rather than what might actually happen? I just want to move on to, I suppose, caveats and warnings. So measurement really in any environment has implications. It has benefits, it has consequences. So like anything else in any organization or institution, measurement is something that you need to act on and examine and figure out what you want to improve. So if you like, I've retrenched and gone all the way back to that first slide about stimulus, sensor, control center, effector and response. And these are just little sort of, I suppose, warning points. So be cautious. Applying a target to a measure fundamentally inhibits its ability to sense. So, it means that people start chasing the target rather than actually chasing the outcome. Be diligent. Design what are you measuring and why at any particular point of process or organization. Because if you're not asking those questions, what is the control center really monitoring and why? And in the control center, then you can ask this whole question about being careful about what is being presented and how is that being presented. So again, there's a mountain of difference between the tabular chart and the statistical process control chart. And then right at the end, and I continually have discussions with people about this, there is no such thing as a solution. There are situations we develop things which we think are going to make things better, but of course all actions, all responses, all counteractions have consequences. Obviously plan, do, study, act is really helpful here, but I think we need to make sure that we don't build in any organization, anyone using measurement and continual improvement, an expectation that once you've done the solution once to a particular situation, it's going to fix it because it will have consequences. Something else will happen. And you need to look for the something else. What are the consequences? What might they be? What might you then be able to look at and act upon? I notice a couple of comments here about that in predetermining the answer, in reality, you don't know what you would be capable of. I think it's a good question. It's a good thought, Kevin. And then John, 90% of what we call management making difficult for people to get things done. I think Drucker's right on the nail here, isn't he, really? And actually management should be, in many cases, I would argue, a lot about this piece, this little cycle that we're talking about, which is that what's going on, how can I make sense of it? Do I need to take action? What does that response need to be? How do I resource the response? And then look for what happens as a result. And then I'm just going to point you to a bit of guidance. There is an article by Alan Clark from that was published in CQI Space, which is it's a big long link, but it's essentially about what we loosely described as decisionology, the study of making decisions in organisations. And of course, there's more stuff in the resources page of the Deming Alliance, but that article's there if you want to go off and hunt it down. And we will put this slide set up so that you can actually go and find that article in the CQI website. It's just an openly accessible article. You don't have to be a CQI member to go and see it. then finally, sort of Parish, one comment from need to be cognizant dysfunction affects the performance measurement if not done carefully. Absolutely. So this whole point, Parish, this, you know about the consequences. You know, not sensing, not having a good control center, not taking effect, not taking response or doing the wrong response. All of those things have effects or consequences. In fact, taking no action when there should be action, or taking the wrong action when you shouldn't do something, could be just as harmful. I'm just going to open it up. Any further questions and thoughts? I'm just going to go back. We have about 6 minutes left, so 6 minutes worth of discussion time starts now.
Really enjoyed the presentation, Tony. Thank you very much. Yeah, and if I just kind of, if I've got a couple of minutes, please. Taking the example of the ambulance service again, I think the dysfunctionality in that setting has manifested in many different ways. So it has manifested in the terms of the pressure and the work intensity on the staff and the paramedics, because it has made the job, because ambulance demand increases almost by 5% on a year-to-year basis. That puts a lot of pressure on the ambulance service. So historically, for the last 10 years, barring one, I think, investment land, no ambulance service has been able to meet their target all the time. It is one of the most difficult targets within the NHS, as you would imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates a lot of pressure, because if this is the only thing they are measuring, I think everybody's minds and attention, especially of the senior leaders, are focused around that, because their funding is still governed by how well they perform. So, and the other impact which it has shown increasing over the last few years, and I've been writing about it, is on staff's health and well-being, on mental health, because this is having a detrimental effect on their well-being, because people just can't cope about it. You can't come to a shift, and it's almost like going after job after job after job in 12-hour shift. There's no kind of time to reflect, and really question what we are doing. So today you've got paramedics who have got a master's qualification. Some of them even have a PhD. But what's happening is, on a Friday night, if you get posted anywhere in a city center, most of the jobs you're going to get are the ones where people are drunk, had a fight, can't remember where they live, and they're not clinical incidents at all. And that is creating a lot of frustration in the sector. So to an extent that overall there's almost like between 15 and 20% vacancies for the national paramedics. In London, for example, I don't know whether you know this, 60% of the paramedics who are working come from Australia.
Wow.
Or 30% of the paramedics who work in the Northwest are Polish paramedics.
I mean, it would be interesting, wouldn't it, Parish, to ask the people who run the organization in that space, what is your learning? What are you doing to monitor and measure and assess learning and growth within your balanced scorecard? And just ask them how much of the balanced scorecard relates to people's ability to learn, reflect, deal with issues. I mean, I was just fascinated. I was really struck. I've been watching some of the ambulance series that's set in Liverpool, and just people dealing with the trauma of going to certain cases as an ambulance paramedic, and how they actually deal emotionally with that. It's incredibly tough.
And it's taking its toll. So I've listened recently a couple of pieces on the impact of COVID on the frontline staff and on their mental health, and it's fascinating. So, but anyway, I don't want to take everybody's time. I'm sure other colleagues would have other questions as well.
Good points. Thank you, though. One last question, thank you. And I think we've only got 3 minutes left, so we can try and squeeze a little one in. Anyone got a small question? No? Well, it looks like we've got no small questions. So I think actually, thank you for attending. Thank you for all your comments and chat and questions and thoughts and sharing. If there's anyone who thinks, if you come up with a question or you want to re-explore, there is a further version of this coming up in the middle of July, which you'll find the links to from the Deming Alliance website. and we will put the slides up. Parish, if you have anything you would like to share with the group, or even with the wider community, please let us have what you'd like to share and let us know how we can best share that. And other than that, hope this was useful. Hope that it was sort of gave you some ideas and hopefully some ways of thinking about measurement systems and how they apply in organizations and other environments. And obviously, I hope to see you at another one of these, or if you want to come back, if you're that much of a masochist, on the next version of this one. Thank you very much for attending, everyone.
Tony, before we go, Tony, I just wanted to say that.
Yes, Ron.
Can you hear me okay? I just wanted to say that I had not thought about the process, the measurement process before, in such detail, actually. And
Okay.
it's likely to be very useful for me to communicating with other people so they can actually see what's actually involved. Because quite often, for example, I'll say to somebody, let's measure something. And a little while afterwards, I'll find actually they didn't actually understand what I wanted to measure at all. They didn't understand the variability.
Yeah, the process and the definition part of it, I think, are really powerful. I mean, they're a little mechanistic, potentially, but if you use them well and you communicate with them, they can be really powerful, really useful.
Okay, but I've never actually seen the process defined in that way before. Is this a new thing from you, or is this?
It's something I developed. I mean, the measurement definition I developed as well. So they're just tools to actually make process measurement easier and more understandable for people.
Right. Thank you very much, Tony. That was great.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. Well, we're out of time, everyone. Thank you for all your questions. You may now leave the call, and thank you for joining. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Tony.
Bye.
It's been a joy to talk about measurement as a process rather than measurement as something that simply